Human rights and civil liberties attorney Jameel Jaffer is a former deputy legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union and has been the director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University since its founding in 2016. He's also an executive editor of the national security blog Just Security, and he joins me now to talk about the legal rights of protesters and journalists and more. Jameel, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So before we get into it, tell us about the Knight First Amendment Institute. What exactly do y'all do?
Sure. So we're, I guess, still a relatively new institute. We were created in 2016 by Columbia University and the Knight Foundation to focus on press freedom and freedom of speech, especially in relation to new technology. We have a litigation program, a research program, policy and public education. We were around during the first Trump administration and, brought some significant First Amendment litigation back then, including the cases that challenged public officials blocking of critics from their social media accounts. So we sued President Trump over his practice of, suppressing dissent on his Twitter account, and successfully won those cases. And now we're litigating all sorts of challenges to the suppression of speech by the Trump administration, including, a big case on behalf of the American Association of University Professors against the arrests and detentions and threatened deportation of students who engaged in protests on campus last year. We also have a case against the U.S. Department of Agriculture for purging its website of important data sets that scientists and others, have relied on. And like so many other people, we're extremely concerned about the growing crackdown on protests and press rights in relation to the ICE raids.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because coming up this weekend on Saturday is No King's Day. And obviously we'll see what the turnout turns out to be. But there's a simply incredible number of protests planned all across the country and even overseas. Why is this so important?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I suppose it's a very cliched sentence, but democracy in action. This is what it means to have a working democracy, is people express their views publicly. They join together to make clear to the government and others that they disagree or maybe agree with government policy. This is has been part of the American tradition from the beginning, and it's a right protected by the First Amendment. Your right to go out and assemble with other people and protest publicly. This is protected by the First Amendment, and I think it's exceptionally important that people feel free to exercise this right now.
So what is the proper role of law enforcement at protests like this? Because it feels often like law enforcement thinks its role is to suppress this dissent, but that's not what it should be, right?
No, absolutely not. The principal role of law enforcement at public protests should be protecting the right of people to protest peacefully. Now, obviously, law enforcement has a legitimate interest, and we want them to respond to people, individuals who are acting violently or dangerously. They have to respond to those kinds of incidents, and they should. But they should respond in a measured way, and they should do it with due regard to the right of everybody else to protest peacefully. Unfortunately, that's not always what we have seen, especially over the last few days. There's been, a lot of evidence that law enforcement is, in some cases, deliberately, using force unnecessarily or excessively against protesters, in some cases targeting journalists, and that is, absolutely not what they should be doing. They are undermining the rights that they're supposed to be protecting.
So talk about these First Amendment rights from a practical standpoint, because as we just discussed, and over the years, we've obviously seen many local law enforcement organizations really not knowing or caring about these rights. And on top of that, we've got the Trump administration making it pretty clear that in their eyes, in a lot of cases, protest itself is to them just a flat out criminal act. So how do, if you're in one of these protests and the government is acting in a way that suppresses your rights, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, well, first, I agree with you. It's so shocking to hear senior government officials, including the president, referring to protest as if it's, in the same terms as you'd use to talk about an enemy invasion or something like that, that we are going to respond to protest with heavy force or with, I think heavy force is the phrase he used, but something along those lines. The president wasn't focused on unlawful activity. He wasn't focused on the handful of people who might be disrupting these things violently. He was focused on the right to protest. And he said, you exercise that right and we will respond with heavy force. And that is absolutely, an affront to the First Amendment and everything it represents. So that is really concerning to hear that message being delivered by the nation's most senior officials. And, as always, government personnel, civilian and military, lower down the line, will hear that message and, I worry will act on it. But that is not how the First Amendment is supposed to work. It's not how the Constitution is supposed to work. People protesting in the streets peacefully are exercising a constitutional right in the same way that when you go to the ballot box and you vote for, a public official, you're exercising a core democratic right. This is as core to our system as, that right. And it's really, really disturbing that the president and other senior officials seem not to understand that.
To be fair, they seem to have the same view of voting for someone other than
That's
them.
true.
So
That's true. That's true.
they are consistent, if nothing else.
Yes, in this particular respect, they are. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm starting to get the sense maybe they don't care about the Constitution all that much. I know
Yeah.
that's a crazy thing to say,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. I think it's hard to avoid any other conclusion at this point.
yeah.
Or
So to
worse,
go
it's not that they're indifferent to it. They see it as an obstacle to what they actually want to achieve. That they see the First Amendment as a problem, and not as something as a kind of feature of our democracy that we should all protect and be proud of, but rather as a threat to what they want to achieve. And that's a really, I don't have the words to express how disturbing that is.
Yeah, and again, which is odd because they will blather on and on about quote unquote free speech when it comes to certain words that they want to use without people saying, hey, that's not cool.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think that, free speech is like so many of these phrases, abstract and
yeah,
malleable and, just like national security and, all sorts of terrible things have been done in the name of free speech, just like all sorts of terrible things have been done in the name of national security. Just because you put the label free speech on it doesn't mean that, what you're doing is actually consistent with the values that we think of as core to the First Amendment. And over the last, certainly over the last few months, but I would go back even further, like over the last few years, we've seen government officials increasingly using free speech or flying the flag of free speech while they're engaged in outrageous forms of censorship. And I think that's what's happening here too. You see the Trump administration pretending to defend free speech, while calling in the Marines to intimidate people from exercising this basic free speech right.
yeah. I mean, look, it's free speech for me, not for thee. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it's very clear that that's their position. So, as you said, the Knight Institute has brought a lot of legal suits against the government, against people who would seek to take away the rights of protesters. What should protesters do when their rights are being violated, whether it's by law enforcement, local law enforcement, sheriffs or police, whether it's federal agents, whether it's National Guard or military? Assuming that, you want to have the best legal case
Mhm.
going forward, what should protesters do? Is there an answer for that?
Well, I'm not sure there's a single answer, but I guess I could offer like a couple ideas. So one
Sure.
is you don't want law enforcement to have the ability to mischaracterize your conduct as violent or unlawful. So you have to be, not just really careful about how you act, but really careful about how you talk about it. I mean, presumably people are going to be taping this interaction. You can assume that people are taping the interaction, which is, a good thing, but, act in a way that doesn't give anyone the opportunity later on to mischaracterize what you did or what you said. That's one thing. The second thing is make sure that everything is documented, so if nobody's taping it, then see if you can get somebody to tape the interaction. If you can, talk to witnesses after. So, if you had an interaction with the law enforcement that, went the wrong way, and you want to be able to hold people accountable after the fact, then while you're there, talk to other people who saw it. try to get their contact information so that you can, call them up afterwards, and ask them to testify or offer statements or corroborate whatever it is that, you said or did. And then, there are often, organizations on the ground that are focused on documenting police abuse and holding law enforcement accountable for any abuses. Those organizations are different from one place to the next, but
Mhm.
some national organizations that are often on the scene of these protests, and this is not news to anybody, but the ACLU, the National
Sure.
Lawyers Guild, they can, even if they can't provide assistance, they can often refer you to somebody who can provide assistance.
That's all great advice. Along these lines, was it last year that Knight produced the documentary Flashpoint Protests, Policing, and the Press?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was released a bit very late in 2023, but then, last
Oh,
year
okay.
was the year that the LA Times featured it. So yeah, this is a documentary that we did. It grew out of a report. We had Joel Simon, who is the former executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. He was a visiting fellow at the Knight Institute in 2023, and he wrote a report about the set of issues at the intersection of policing, protest, and the press. And then later on, we made a documentary film that was sort of inspired by the report and the issues that were addressed in the report. And it's really about this quite complicated set of questions about how the police should police protests, and in particular, how they should interact with journalists at protests, especially in an age when a lot of the people doing the documentation that only journalists used to do are now ordinary civilians, just,
Right.
participants in the public protests carrying phones are, doing some of the work that journalists used to do. And yet we still have a need for the journalists who are working for major outlets and have the ability to bring what's happening in any particular place to a national audience. And so, how do we want the police to, for example, if there is a curfew, who should be allowed to stay after the curfew in order to document what's going on? Or if the police, have a line beyond which they're not allowing protesters to proceed, should journalists be allowed to proceed past that line? And if so, how do the police decide who counts as a journalist and who doesn't? Now, I will say that, this discussion of the rules around the police and protests sort of assumes as a predicate that the police are operating in good faith, and that,
Right.
they actually want to distinguish between protesters and the press, and they are not actually intending to target the press, but quite the opposite, that they are, trying to protect the press. And that is often the case. I don't want to suggest that the police are always, interested in principally in suppressing dissent or targeting journalists. But, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen over and over again, evidence of law enforcement officials, law enforcement agents going out of their way to, number one, uh, train their weapons at civilian protesters, and number two, use their weapons against journalists in a targeted way. Like, actually, I mean, you've seen the footage of the
Yeah.
Australian journalist who was shot, on live on live TV, and that's a different set of issues. Then you're not talking about, what rules should law enforcement agents who are operating in good faith adopt in this context. You're just asking them to, abide by the most basic, honor the most basic human rights protections, and it's, unfortunate that at least in some cases over the last few weeks we found ourselves in that position. But still,
Yeah,
I would
for
say
sure.
that, people should take a look at this film. It's since the Night Institute produced it, this is like in a way inevitably self promotion. But I rewatched it yesterday, the day before, and I wish it were not as prescient as it is. It is like the main message of the film is that, like, if we don't address these issues now, then the next time there are major, there are mass demonstrations, the rules that have sort of held together until now are probably not going to be sufficient. And I think that's what we're seeing in the streets, that there's just no the accountability frameworks that we have
Yeah.
developed for protests in the past, and the operation of law enforcement in relation to protests in the past, those accountability frameworks are not nearly adequate to the task. And I think we're kind of seeing that now.
Yeah, particularly when you have at least some law enforcement quote unquote, wearing masks and not wearing any
No
identifying
ID. Yeah. Yeah.
insignia or anything on their uniforms. Yeah. And speaking of being prescient, a few months ago, you wrote a blog post at the Knight Institute's website in which you said, it may be the arrests of student protesters that pose the gravest threat to our fast fading democracy. And given what we've seen out of Los Angeles in the last few weeks, I'm sure you take no pleasure in saying I told you so, but you did tell us so.
Yeah, I mean, I see the the arrest of students, on the basis of their protest activity as one of the things that kind of led us to the point we're in,
Yeah.
in now. But as always, I think when those students were arrested, there were many people who said to themselves, "Look, these are foreign students. There's a line between foreign students and everybody else." Or they said, "This is pro-Palestinian speech, and there's a line between that and what I want to do." And, it's always true that, the first people targeted are the ones who are, on the margins, least sympathetic to the majority. But it
Right.
was obvious to me, and I won't pretend that it was obvious only to me. Many other people
Sure.
said this too. But it was obvious to me that it was not going to stop with the pro-Palestinian foreign students. That was just the beginning. And I worry that even what we've seen over the last, couple of weeks is also, just the beginning. I'm glad that the protests are growing. I'm glad that people are willing to exercise uh, uh, their First Amendment rights in this particular way. But I also, when I listen to President Trump saying, we're going to meet this with heavy force, I worry that what the Trump administration is really trying to do is provoke the kind of reaction that would justify the force they have already authorized. They're calling in the Marines, they're commandeering the National Guard in circumstances that in my view, plainly don't require it. The California says that it's able to address these protests on its own. It has done that many, many times in the past, and yet President Trump is federalizing the National Guard and calling in the Marines and threatening again heavy force or whatever the phrase was. And I think that it's not so much a response to what's already happening on the ground, but I worry that what it reflects is a desire on the part of President Trump to create the circumstances on the ground that would justify the force he's already authorized and give
Yeah.
him a pretext for authorizing even more. And it would be a terrible, terrible thing if all of us got accustomed to the sight of, armed soldiers in the streets of our major cities and at the sites of, public protest. That can't help but have a terrible chilling effect on the exercise of First Amendment rights. And, soldiers are not trained to handle public protests. They're trained to, fight enemies overseas. And, asking them to do this work, I think is could go very wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Jameel, thank you so much for joining us and for all the work that you've done throughout your career and for all the work that the Knight First Amendment Institute does now. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much, Andy. Great to talk with you.